She stood 6 feet 8, her shadow spilling across the red dust like a mountain moving. They called her Goliath's daughter. On a night so quiet the crickets dared not sing, her master's skull cracked under her bare hands, one final sound that echoed through the cotton fields like God's own judgment. In the low country of Mississippi, where the air hung thick with rot and humidity, stood Briar Hollow Plantation, a name whispered like a curse. Built in 1829 by Colonel Asa Whitlock, it was known for its cotton, its cruelty, and the towering woman who would one day unmake its master. Her name was Nara, though most never dared to speak it aloud. Nara was born of unknown parentage. Some said her mother died birthing her, others that her father was no man at all but a beast torn from the wilderness. From infancy, she was unlike any other, massive, silent, and impossible to tame. Her limbs were thick as tree trunks, her back broad as an ox's. Even as a child, she could lift a plow meant for 2 grown men. By the time she turned 16, she stood taller than any man on the plantation. Her presence alone unsettled overseers. They whispered that the devil had built her from the bones of fallen giants. Colonel Whitlock saw something else: power. He paraded her like a monstrous prize when guests arrived, calling her Goliath's daughter, half in jest, half in awe. Yet behind her silence lay something deeper than fear. She watched, she remembered, she endured. It was said that Nara never flinched, even under the lash. She took punishment without sound, her expression fixed, her eyes distant. It was this stillness that frightened the men more than her size. For in her gaze was no submission, only waiting. The slaves whispered that she was chosen, that one day she would bring retribution to Briar Hollow. And in 1843, the signs began. Strange accidents plagued the plantation. Tools snapped mid-use, horses refused to pull, and one night, a cotton gin burst into flames. Whitlock blamed the workers, but deep down, he feared the silence behind Nara's eyes. For in that silence, he sensed a storm gathering, a storm that would end his bloodline. If you lived in that town, would you have stayed or run? Before she crushed her master's skull, Nara had already been broken 100 times in other ways. Whitlock's overseer, a sadist named Grady Finch, took pleasure in testing her limits. He chained her to wagon wheels, forced her to drag them across mud, and laughed when the ground trembled beneath her steps. Yet Nara endured with a stillness that seemed unnatural. She never cried, never screamed. Finch called her a hollow thing, and perhaps he was right. Something inside her had long since gone silent. At night, she slept in a separate shed, far from the others. Not for privilege, but because no one wanted to hear the chains clinking as she turned in her sleep. The other slaves feared her, not out of hate but awe. She was their omen. When Whitlock's wife, Lydia, took ill and died, the colonel's mind began to rot. He blamed the fields, the air, the slaves, especially Nara. She had grown into something too vast, too human, too impossible to ignore. He ordered Finch to break her completely. But something happened that no man saw coming. During a thunderstorm one summer night, Finch entered her shed to beat her once more. Lightning split the sky. The next morning, Finch was found outside, his arm bent backward, his jaw shattered. He lived, but never spoke again. The overseers whispered that Nara had summoned lightning itself. Others swore she had crushed his throat but spared his life, as a warning. Whitlock refused to believe it, until he saw Finch's eyes. They said he looked at Nara the way a man looks at God and knows he's been judged. Tell me in the comments, do you believe that was fate or something darker? Colonel. Asa Whitlock was a man built on control. Every field, every hand, every breath on Briar Hollow moved to his will, or so he believed. But after the night Grady Finch was found broken and silent, something shifted in the colonel's world. His authority began to feel borrowed. He started to watch Nara not as a master, but as a creature he could not fully own. Her silence haunted him more than rebellion ever could. Each morning, as she carried water from the well or lifted bales twice her weight, Whitlock found himself unable to look away. She was strength unspoken, a monument of flesh and defiance. Her presence filled the air like thunder waiting for release. In the evenings, when the cicadas began their dirge, Whitlock would pour himself bourbon and sit on the porch, staring at the shed across the yard. The flicker of a single lantern through its cracks would drive him near to madness. What was she thinking? Did she dream? Did she remember the lash? Did she hate him? Soon his curiosity turned into obsession. He ordered that she no longer work the fields, claiming she was too valuable. Instead, she was to remain near the main house, under his eye. The other slaves avoided her, fearing the colonel's attention. And Nara. She neither resisted nor obeyed. She simply existed, a calm so vast it frightened even the wind. At night, Whitlock would visit the shed. He never touched her, never spoke a word. He would stand there, breathing heavily, waiting for a tremor of fear that never came. Her stillness mocked him. Her silence consumed him. The rumors spread fast. Some said the colonel sought to breed her for her size. Others swore he kept her close to ward off demons. But the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. Whitlock had begun to worship what he could not break. He stopped sleeping. His letters grew incoherent, his ledgers unfinished. Guests found him pacing the halls, muttering about giants and fallen angels. He claimed Nara was not born of this world, that she was punishment wearing a woman's skin. The fields grew untended. The slaves whispered of curses, of strange lights near the shed. And still Nara remained silent, watching the man who had once ruled everything she saw disintegrate before her eyes. By autumn, Colonel Whitlock was a ghost of himself, gaunt, trembling, driven mad by the quiet power he could not name. And that winter, he gave her a command that sealed his fate forever. Would you have seen it coming? It was the winter of 1844, and frost clung to the dying cotton fields like ash. Colonel Asa Whitlock's mind was unraveling by the day. He wandered the house barefoot, muttering scripture, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling as if some unseen force lived beneath his skin. Servants whispered that he no longer recognized his own reflection. One night, under a moon white as bone, Whitlock summoned Nara to the veranda. Snow fell in slow, eerie silence, coating the wooden steps between them. She stood before him, barefoot, immense, her breath misting in the cold. He gazed up at her with a mixture of awe and terror, his voice breaking as he spoke. "You were made for obedience," he said. "You were made for me." But his voice faltered when he saw her eyes. They were not angry, not even defiant. They were ancient, like something that had seen the rise and fall of countless men like him. He raised his cane and pointed toward the frozen field. "Tomorrow, you will break that land," he ordered, alone. It was an impossible task. Even 20 men could not plow through that frozen soil. Yet Nara said nothing. She simply turned and walked away, her silhouette dissolving into the mist. The next morning, Whitlock awoke to silence. The house was still, the workers gone. Outside, he found the earth split wide open, furrows dug deep into the frost, as though the land itself had been torn by rage. And there she stood, motionless, in the center of the field, hands covered in blood and dirt, her breath steady. She had done it, with no tools, no oxen, just her bare hands. Whitlock fell to his knees, whispering prayers that made no sense. He realized then that he had commanded not a woman, but something born of the old world, something that answered only to judgment. That night, he locked himself inside the manor. The shutters rattled. The fire refused to stay lit. He heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, heavy as thunder. He reached for his pistol but could not bring himself to load it. "She's only a woman," he told himself. But deep down, he no longer believed it. The next morning, the slaves found the front doors wide open and the colonel's cane splintered in the doorway. He was nowhere to be found, and from that day on, the field never grew again. Would you have stepped into that field, knowing what she had done? The morning Colonel Whitlock disappeared, Briar Hollow fell into a strange silence. The house stood untouched. Fireplace cold, breakfast untouched, doors hanging open as though something vast had passed through them. No struggle, no footprints. Only a faint trail of red earth leading toward the northern woods, where the fog hung low and eternal. The slaves gathered near the quarters, whispering prayers, afraid even to look toward the house. They said the colonel had been taken by the spirits he mocked, dragged into the dirt by the same hands that once tilled it. Some claimed they'd heard it that night, a crack, not of gunfire, but of bone. Only one soul claimed to have seen her. A boy named Elijah, barely 12, who hid beneath the corn bins. He said he watched Nara walk from the manor, slow and calm, her skin glistening with sweat though the air was freezing. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, her hands open and red. Behind her, the door creaked shut as if pulled by unseen fingers. When they asked Elijah what she looked like in that moment, he said, like she'd finally remembered what she was. For days, the overseers searched the woods, finding nothing but shattered branches and a single boot, Whitlock's, half buried in mud. No grave, no remains, just silence. Nara returned to her shed as if nothing had happened. She ate little, spoke never. The others watched her with reverence and dread. Some began leaving food at her door, cornbread, dried meat, even flowers, not out of charity but ritual. They feared her power, but they also saw something divine in it. Weeks passed, and rumors spread beyond Briar Hollow. Neighbors rode in from nearby plantations to see the woman said to have called down judgment, but none who came left easy. They said when she looked at them they saw themselves, not as masters, but as trespassers on a land that would one day reclaim them all. Winter deepened. The cotton fields died, and Nara began walking the plantation at night, barefoot, her shadow stretching across the frost. The workers swore she was following something unseen, whispering in a language older than English, older than chains. One night the entire plantation awoke to the sound of wood splintering. The great oak by the river, the tree where Whitlock once carried out his punishments, had fallen without wind. Nara stood beside it at dawn, her palm pressed against the trunk. When asked what happened, she finally spoke for the first time in her life. "Justice," she said. And then she smiled. Would you have met her eyes that morning, or turned away like the others? After the fall of the great oak, the land itself began to change. The soil turned black and slick, like it had bled beneath the surface. The air grew heavy, the kind of thick where every breath felt stolen. And though the plantation still stood, no one worked its fields. The overseers had fled, the servants vanished, and those who remained whispered that Briar Hollow had been claimed by her. Nara moved through the silence like a wraith. Each morning she emerged from her shed, her face blank, her steps deliberate. The others kept their distance, bowing their heads as she passed. They called her Mother of Vengeance, Daughter of Goliath, the living curse. But Nara herself seemed changed. Less woman now, more echo. She spent her days near the field where Whitlock had last stood, pressing her hands into the dirt, as if trying to listen to the earth's memory. Sometimes she spoke softly to herself, in words no one recognized. Elijah, the boy who'd seen her that night, became her silent shadow. He would bring her water and bread, though she rarely ate. He once asked, "Miss Nara, where'd he go?" She looked down at him, eyes distant. "Back where all cruelty goes," she murmured, "into the ground." As spring came, strange things began to grow where the blood had soaked the soil. Cotton with red-tinged blooms, roots that spread like veins. Animals avoided the fields, and those who entered claimed they heard whispering in the wind, voices crying, singing, praying. Travelers began to speak of Briar Hollow as a place cursed by divine wrath. Some said the ground had turned sacred. Others swore it was damned. Preachers arrived to pray over the land, but their horses would not approach the gate. In town, rumors multiplied, that Whitlock's spirit wandered the fields, that his voice could be heard begging for forgiveness. And always, in every version, Nara stood beside him, silent, unyielding. his eternal judge. One summer night, a fire broke out in the main house. The flames climbed fast, roaring through the rafters. No one tried to save it. They watched from the hill as the plantation that had once enslaved hundreds burned itself into history. Through the inferno, they saw her silhouette in the doorway, unmoving, framed by orange light. When dawn came, the fire was gone, the house reduced to ash, but there was no body, no bones, no sign of Nara at all. Only a set of footprints in the soot, leading toward the forest and stopping at the river's edge. Would you have followed those footprints, knowing what waited beyond the trees? The river near Briar Hollow had always been slow, muddy, and harmless. But after the fire, its waters darkened, thick as ink. Locals swore it changed overnight, carrying the taste of iron and ash. Fish floated to the surface, bloated and still. Livestock refused to drink from it, and the people whispered one word over and over, Nara. Search parties gathered along its banks, lanterns swinging in the mist. They found the footprints descending into the shallows, each print deeper than the last, as though her body grew heavier with every step. But the trail ended where the river turned blackest. No body, no clothing, only the faint echo of a current that refused to move. For weeks, the river ran silent. No birds sang near it. Children from nearby farms claimed they saw a figure standing in the water at dusk, tall, unmoving, the reflection rippling but never breaking. Others said they heard humming, a low melody carried across the current, almost too deep to be human. Then came the drownings. First was a white farmhand named Luther Briggs, who'd gone to wash near the bend. They found him the next morning, face down in the shallows, eyes wide, mouth filled with silt. A week later, 2 hunters vanished. Only, their rifles were recovered, both bent at the barrels as if crushed by enormous force. By then, no one dared approach the river. They called it the Hollow's Vein, believing it carried the curse through the land like blood through a body. Even, miles away, people swore they could smell it, iron, smoke, and the faint sweetness of something rotting. But Elijah, the boy who once served her, did not fear the water. He began visiting the river every night, leaving offerings, cornbread, flowers, candles. He said she was not gone, only waiting. She's not angry, he told the others. She's remembering. Years later, when the war began and men marched south through Mississippi, soldiers camped by that same river. By dawn, 3 were missing, and their commanding officer reported seeing a woman of impossible height wading through the mist, her eyes shining like lanterns beneath the surface. The river was renamed Nara's Crossing. Maps eventually erased it, but locals still refused to speak its former name. They said if you stand there long enough, especially when the water runs still, you can hear bones cracking beneath the current. Would you have listened to that sound, or run before it reached you? By the spring of 1851, nearly 7 years after the burning of Briar Hollow, the story of Goliath's daughter had already turned into a fireside warning. Parents in nearby towns would whisper her name to keep children from wandering near the woods. But the children, as children often do, were drawn to what their elders feared. It began in the town of Port Gibson, 30 miles east of the ruins. 3 children were found at dawn standing knee-deep in the marsh, their feet sunk in mud, their eyes wide and unblinking. When questioned, they each spoke the same phrase. She called us by name. Doctors said they were sleepwalking. Preachers said they were possessed. But the mother swore all 3 had been born on the same night, the night Briar Hollow burned. Soon, the dream spread. Children across the delta began waking in the middle of the night, whispering stories of a tall woman with eyes like lanterns. They said she didn't speak. She only reached out her hand as if offering comfort. Some said she smiled. Others said she wept. The strange part? Each child could describe her the same way. The scar on her forearm, the cracked nails, the faint scent of ash and river water. Adults dismissed it as hysteria. But when the drawings began appearing, fear returned. Crude sketches carved into wooden floors, etched into school desks, even drawn in soot on windows, each showing the same towering figure standing over a burning house. Elijah, now grown and living as a preacher, was summoned to investigate. He had long buried his memories of the plantation, but when he saw those drawings, his hands trembled. "She's not haunting them," he said softly. "She's remembering through them." That night, Elijah returned to the ruins of Briar Hollow. The fields were wild now, the house long gone, replaced by thorns and black moss. He stood at the edge of the river, calling her name once, twice, 3 times. The water rippled, then stilled. From the shadows of the trees, he swore he saw her, tall, unmoving, her skin pale as moonlight, her eyes empty but alive. She did not speak. She only lifted her hand slowly and pointed toward the town. Elijah fell to his knees, knowing what it meant. The curse was not vengeance anymore. It was inheritance. The sins of the master had found new soil to grow in. He whispered into the darkness, "What do you want of us?" The water answered with a sound like breath. "Remember." Would you have believed her mercy, or feared what remembering might awaken? By 1855, the town of Port Gibson had turned its back on the river. The old road leading to Briar Hollow was sealed off with crosses and warning signs. No one farmed there anymore. Even the bravest hunters refused to enter its midst. The people called it the hallowed ground, though no preacher dared to bless it. But forgetting is a fragile thing. The past has a way of whispering through wood and water, and Nara's memory, whatever she had become, was not finished. Each year, on the anniversary of the fire, the same pattern repeated. A storm rolled in without warning, rain fell black as soot, and thunder shook the fields where cotton once grew. Windows shattered in the night, livestock fled their pens, and every house near the river woke to the same sound, a woman humming beneath the wind. At first, the townsfolk held candlelight vigils, praying for her soul. But when their candles flickered out all at once, they stopped praying altogether. Fear had replaced faith. Children who still dreamed of her were sent away to relatives. Their drawings, those eerie images of a tall woman standing in smoke, were burned in the churchyard. But no matter how hard they tried, the smell of ash never left. Elijah, now gray-haired and frail, continued to preach that she was not a demon, but a reckoning. "You cannot bury what you built on blood," he told them. "You can only face it." But no one listened. The town council forbade any mention of her name in public. The word Nara was stricken from the local records, the plantation renamed on all maps. Yet silence is its own kind of prayer. One summer evening, lightning struck the steeple of St. Isaac's Church, the very one where Whitlock had once sat in the front pew. The bell fell through the roof and shattered the altar. When people rushed inside, they found the walls streaked with mud, handprints reaching upward, massive handprints. Elijah stood among the crowd, trembling. He recognized them. "She's not haunting this place," he whispered. "She's reminding it who it belongs to." The town elders voted to abandon the church entirely. Within a year, ivy consumed the walls, and the bell lay rusting in the grass. Birds would not nest there. Travelers would not stop. By the time the Civil War reached Mississippi, Port Gibson had become a ghost town. But sometimes, on nights when the moon was low, locals swore they saw her shadow stretching across the old fields, taller than ever, her steps slow and deliberate, as though she was counting every grave beneath her feet. Would you have stayed in that town, or followed the shadow into the fields to see if she was real? When the Civil War swept through Mississippi in 1863, the Union Army stumbled upon what remained of Port Gibson, a ghost town swallowed by vines and silence. Captain Samuel Hawthorne wrote in his journal, "The place looks untouched by war, yet feels as if something far older has already claimed it." His men camped by the river, unaware of the stories buried beneath its dark waters. They spoke of the strange stillness, of the way sound seemed to die before reaching the trees. One soldier said it felt like the air itself was listening. The first night, 2 horses vanished. The second, a sentry was found at dawn, kneeling in the mud, with both hands clasped as though in prayer. His eyes were open, his lips caked with silt. When they lifted his body, the earth beneath was disturbed, shaped like two enormous hands pressed into the soil. Hawthorne ordered the men to move camp, but the river followed them. No matter how far they went, they heard it, the faint hum of a woman's voice, deep, mournful, rising from the current. When they found the ruins of Briar Hollow, it was as if time had paused. The fields lay barren but untouched by shell fire. In the ashes of the old house, they discovered iron chains fused into the floor, twisted and blackened, too thick to be from any tool of war. That night, rain began to fall. Black rain, thick, metallic, and reeking of rust and earth. The soldiers ran for shelter, but in the distance, one figure remained standing, a giant silhouette in the downpour, unmoving, her eyes reflecting the lightning. "She was real," wrote Hawthorne in his final entry. "The land remembers her, the water carries her. She is not a ghost. She is the judgment they tried to bury." When reinforcements arrived days later, they found the entire regiment gone. Tents collapsed, weapons scattered, footprints leading into the river, and ending there. Only Hawthorne's soaked journal remained, the ink smudged but legible. Local farmers who came after the war avoided that place. They said crops would not grow near the river anymore, and that every spring, when the water swelled, faces appeared beneath its surface, faces twisted in awe, not pain. By the 1870s, the government declared Briar Hollow uninhabitable, but some nights, travelers still saw her in the distance. Taller than any tree, her outline shimmering in the mist. They say she walks only when the soil is wet enough to remember the blood. Would you have opened that journal, or burned it, before reading what it revealed? By the time the century turned, Briar Hollow no longer appeared on maps. The river had changed course, swallowing the last traces of the old plantation beneath its slow black current. Only a few who lived along its edge remembered the stories, and even fewer dared to speak them aloud. Yet the land itself seemed unable to forget. Travelers described strange patterns in the fields, long sunken impressions that looked like footsteps too large for any man. Old trees near the water bore claw-like marks, their bark splintered as if from a tremendous grip. On certain nights, a soft vibration rolled through the ground, like the faint rhythm of a heart buried deep below. In 1891, a surveyor named Thomas Bell arrived, hired to map the surrounding county. He'd heard the stories but dismissed them as superstition. "Curses are for the fearful," he wrote to his wife. But after 3 nights in the valley, his tone changed. He described seeing a glow by the riverbank, pale, steady, neither fire nor moonlight. He followed it and found what looked like bones rising from the mud, but they weren't human. They were enormous. "A hand," he wrote, "larger than my own chest, reaching upward as if to hold the sky." When he returned the next day, the bones were gone. Only his boot prints remained, and another set beside them, pressed deep into the soil. The locals said the land had accepted him, that it always took those who doubted her. Over the years, the legend evolved. Some called Nara a spirit of vengeance, others a protector of the forgotten dead. But those who truly listened to the old people, the ones whose ancestors had worked those fields, knew the truth. She was both, a curse and a salvation, the embodiment of every cry that had gone unanswered, every injustice left unburied. Elijah's descendants built a small chapel near the old boundary, not to worship her, but to remember. They called it the House of Stillness. Inside hung no cross, no image, only an empty wall of black stone where people came to lay down offerings of cotton, water, and soil. On quiet nights, when the fog rolls through the trees, some say you can hear a woman humming near that chapel, low, patient, eternal. The same song the children once dreamed of. No one has seen her face in generations, but every spring, new footprints appear by the riverbank, as if she walks still, guarding the land that once enslaved her, waiting for the day mankind learns that some soil remembers longer than time itself. Would you have stepped onto that ground? knowing it could remember you too?